Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us today. As you see there, the theme of today's ACI webinar is From the Periphery to the Centre, Cardijn, Pius XI and the YCW, because actually this year is the centenary of the foundation of the YCW, and this week in particular is the centenary of a famous meeting at which Cardijn obtained the approval of Pius XI for the launch, the official launch of the YCW in Belgium. That's the occasion we're celebrating, remembering, but I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of Australia, and I'd like to pay my respects to, I can't even see the screen, to elders past and present. We'll start also with the opening prayer of the YCW, remembering also Janine Bliss, who's passed away recently. Lord Jesus, I thank you for this day. I offer you all my work, my hopes and struggles, my joys and sorrows. Help me and all my fellow workers to think like you, to work with you, to live in you. Help me to love you with all my heart and serve you with all my strength. May your kingdom come in all our places of work, study and leisure, and in all our homes. Give me the courage to challenge what is wrong and keep me faithful to the ideals of the young Christian workers. May those who have suffered for what is right and all who have died on Labour's battlefield share the happiness of your kingdom forever. So I'd like to begin by remembering that today, as I just mentioned, is this week is the centenary of Joseph Cardijn, the founder of the Young Christian Workers Movement, his famous meeting with Pope Pius XI in March 1925. This year we celebrate the foundation of the YCW, but actually the truth is that the movement in fact started some years previously. Cardijn himself often used to say that it started in 1912 when he became a curate at the parish of Notre Dame, Our Lady at Laeken in Belgium, when he started the first study circles for young female workers in that parish. Another big event, turning point of the movement, development point, was after the war in 1919, when there were enough of those young workers groups, both male and female by then, that they began to call themselves a movement, initially known as La Jeunesse Syndicaliste, or in English, the Young Trade Unionists. The girls' movement actually had a different name at that time, Joie and Travail, joy and work. They were the two kind of precursors of what would become in 1924, would take the name of Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne, or with the F added onto it, La Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne Féminine, which became the name under which the movement has become known today around the world in so many countries. But the official foundation that's recognised by the movement right up to today, and the reason we celebrate the centenary this year is because there were a number of key events that happened in 1925. And the first of those was Cardijn's trip to Rome in March of that year to meet with Pope Pius XI to gain his approval. And we'll see in a few minutes why that was necessary. Once that was gained, they were able to hold national congresses for both the JOC and the JOCF, which helped launch the movement officially in Belgium. And probably we could say the third really important event that happened this year was the publication of what they called the Manuel de la Jacques, the YCW manual, which set out the principles and methods of the new movement. But why did a new movement in Belgium, hadn't crossed the borders anywhere, why did they need approval from Pope Pius XI? It's a big story, actually, that is known to those of us who have read Cardijn's biography, possibly long ago, as I did when I was about 21 years old. But anyway, it's interesting to read the way Cardijn spoke about what happened in that year at the end of 1924. He was at Malines, which is the central city of where the archdiocese is based, in a room with the cardinal and his staff around a table. And the cardinal presided as if it was a tribunal, with his vicar general and others with him. And in that tribunal, there was a written speech of complaints read out by Father Louis Picard, who's the chaplain to the Belgian Catholic Youth Association, the national body which organised all the Belgian youth across Belgium. And he had a whole suite of complaints against the movement, which amounted to, in principle, perhaps at a theological level, was breaking the unity of the mystical body of Christ. That was the charge against the YCW. And the meeting concluded, as Cardijn wrote at that time, the Cardinal concluded with a sentence that seemed like a condemnation of the YCW. He and his advisors who were with him were all shocked and stunned, because if it had continued, it would have meant the end of the movement before it had even been officially established. What really was behind that accusation of breaking the unity of the mystical body of Christ? There are actually a number of points. It's quite an astonishing list when you go through them, actually, as I'm going to do now. And the second one, I don't know, perhaps even the most important one, was the YCW's working class option. The Belgian Catholic Youth Association had actually been an initiative of Cardinal Mercier, and the idea was to unite all the different parish groups of young people who are working not just in that archdiocese, but across the whole of Belgium. And then along comes this young priest, kind of operating a little bit outside of that structure, starting a movement which had a very clear and deliberate working class option. As the early name made very clear, La Jeunesse Syndicaliste, the young trade unionists, couldn't be any clearer. No mention of the word Christian. Their discourse, comrades. They call themselves militants. Their imagery, as you can see in that little postcard there, a very working class image of struggle. This shocked people at that time. And of course, in the minds of many people, it associated them with the class struggle and with socialism and communism. This third big point, we don't have a copy. I don't know if it exists in the archives somewhere, the copy of that list of complaints. But the third complaint that we know of from history is the fact that even once they changed their name, they didn't call themselves young Catholic workers. They called themselves young Christian workers. Why did they do that? Because in Belgium at that time, probably the most important political party was a party known as the Catholic Party, which was a conservative political expression of the political will of the Catholic community, which was backed by the hierarchy. On the other hand, Cardijn and the early founders of the YCW, they backed this then new notion of Christian democracy. They weren't interested in actually obtaining political power in terms of dominating the numbers in the parliament. They were more interested in teaching people what democracy really meant, teaching the principles of fraternity, responsibility, discipline, and they wanted to inspire the social and political institutions of Belgium with a Christian spirit. Very, very different from the mentality and the mode of operation of the Catholic Party. So again, this puts them on the outer because they're threatening to break the stronghold of the Catholic Party over political life in Belgium. Quite a serious problem as it was seen by those who belonged to that party and by the hierarchy. And the next point, which is kind of a continuation of the last one, was exactly how they understood what that democracy was. And we can see here how Cardijn described that in 1921. He talked about raising the consciousness and the moral and political responsibility of the working class. Even today, sometimes it raises people's hackles when we talk about consciousness raising. So here's young Cardijn in 1921 speaking about raising the consciousness of the working class. Again, a very Marxist sounding sort of expression, particularly at that time. And they wanted to perfect the flowering of that consciousness and responsibility of the most humble of popular citizens. This is a recipe in the minds of many people at that time for, problems. Now, where did they get this? Is the very interesting point and very significant point. Where did Cardijn and his colleagues get that understanding of democracy from? They got it from a movement in France, which was known as Le Sillon, or the Furrow in English, which had been started some 20 years previously, or actually 30 years nearly at that time, by a young French guy student named Marc Sangnier. And that movement came up with a definition of democracy, which they defined as the social system that tends to maximize the consciousness and responsibility of each person. Exactly the words that Cardijn himself was using. And how are they going to do that? As Marc Sangnier said, I think it's in about 1898 or 99, every citizen must firstly know the state of the country. When the situation is bad, they must seek solutions. And lastly, having found the solutions, they must act. Does that sound familiar to anybody? If it doesn't, probably the next phrase will, because one of their key advisors was a French philosopher known as Leon Leprune. And one of his phrases was, learn to see clearly, learn to judge well, and decide. Any of us from the YCW or the YCS or the other movements, we will recognise the ideas behind that phrase. And these were the ideas that the Sillon had been promoting before. And these are the ideas that had got the Sillon in trouble in France. And look at what happened. On the 20th, I got the 15th, it should be the 25th of August, 1910, Pope, now St. Pius X, wrote a letter to the French bishops called Our Apostolic Charge. And look how he describes the word. It's almost laughable when we think about it from today's perspective. He called the work of the Sillon a chimerical construction, all resting on an ill-understood human dignity, which will is a chimera that will inevitably bring socialism in its train. The end results of this promiscuousness can only be a democracy that is neither Catholic nor Protestant nor Jewish. It'll be a religion larger than the Catholic Church, uniting all brothers and comrades in the kingdom of God. And worst of all, the Sillon, in its work, was escaping the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical authority. These were the charges, not just the charges, but these were the accusations brought against the Sillon in 1910 by Pope Pius X, which led, as you can imagine, to the closing down of that movement immediately afterwards. So here we are back in Belgium 11 years later, and Cardijn invites Marc Sangnier to come to Brussels to talk about all those ideas. And he explicitly claims to be inspired by those ideas publicly in a meeting that was reported in the press at the time. He says, the winds of the air and the birds of the sky carry off this seed and deposit it, sometimes far away, in a field where God's dew fertilizes and multiplies it. Very poetic, and it actually sounds much better in the original French than in my translation. But you can hardly imagine a more explicit claim to be following in the footsteps of the Sillon movement that had been condemned by Pope Pius X in 1910. Well, what does that mean? And this is the next point. Yes, I'll come back on a couple of other points in a few minutes. But that wasn't all of it, what the YCW was doing. They were explicitly following that method that had been pioneered by the Sillon, which we know today as an inductive method, which was contrasted with what was known at the time, or even up to today, as a doctrinal method. And if you see that book cover there, it says Study Circles and Catholic Doctrine, written by a Belgian Jesuit named Valère Honnet. And his phrase at the opening of the book is doctrine first. It was published in 1926. The publisher was the Belgian Catholic Youth Association. So it's a direct attack on what the YCW was doing. It's accusing the YCW of not following the doctrinal method, which actually was quite true. And in fact, the YCW proclaimed it itself. Look at this phrase here this is actually from 1922 by one of Cardijn's colleagues, analysing the doctrinal method, describes it as a bad method, and it explains why it's a bad method. You cannot tell a group of teenage young workers that now we're going to start to study the encyclical Rerum Novarum and dividing it into 10 parts. The inevitable result is by the third meeting, those young people will drift away. And it's rare, this is what Father Van Hordenaard says, it's rare that it will not be necessary to quickly abandon the program. This was their critique of the doctrinal method that so many study circles were using in the church at that time. And so what do they propose in its place? They propose a series of detailed, ongoing inquiries about the issues that affected people in their life, not even about religious issues, about the salary, the working conditions that people were affected by in their workplaces, these teenage young workers working in factories and workshops and all that kind of thing. So the idea was that they were actually going to look at what's happening in the environments, the milieu in which they lived, and try and transform it. And the words that they chose, harking back to what Leonard Leprun had said, were see, judge and act. So this method was very clearly, explicitly in opposition to that doctrinal method that the ACJP was promoting. Not only all that, but in 1924, young Fernand Tonnet, who was the president of the new movement, publishes an article in the YCW paper, which was called La Jeunesse Ouvrière, publicly attacking fascism, that is Mussolini and his followers. And his critique is not just that, in fact, he doesn't actually mention the name Mussolini, but actually you cannot doubt who he's referring to. But actually, Tonnet's attack is against the Catholic sympathizers of fascism. And he even names the French Catholic newspaper, La Croix, which some of you, I think, possibly even subscribe to today, the English edition, La Croix International. At that time, La Croix was publishing articles that were sympathetic to Mussolini, even though Mussolini was attacking those priests and progressive workers in Italy who were often known at that time as the democratic priests. So Tonnet doesn't hesitate to attack these people publicly, and even though he just mentions La Croix in France, people in Belgium, they know he's attacking them also. So doing this publicly is also exposing the YCW itself to a counterattack, which is exactly, of course, what happened in that tribunal with Cardinal Mercier. And when you look at this page here, I've just summarized all those different points I've just made, put them in one page there, and you can see what a list of complaints it is against this new movement that's only getting started, hasn't even had its first National Congress, and you can see why there's a problem for them. You can see why people had a problem with them that were on the other side of what they were doing, that didn't agree with what they were doing. And of course, all this creates a problem for the Cardinal Archbishop of Malines, Brussels, or Malines as it was at that time, Cardinal Mercier. The truth is, he always had an ambivalent relationship with Cardijn. On the one hand, of course, he ordained him in 1906, and he also recognised Cardijn's talent and made him Director of Social Projects for the Brussels region in 1915. So clearly, there's a recognition of Cardijn's talent and organising capacity and the work he was doing. At the same time, it's also clear that Mercier was often worried about what Cardijn was doing. This guy, what's he going to do next? And I think this sort of explains why, at that time, Mercier sort of found himself in a dilemma. But what could he do? Cardijn has publicly linked himself to the Sion in France, which had been explicitly condemned by Pope Pius X 11 years before. The only thing he could possibly do was give Cardijn a letter to take to Pius XI in Rome. So this is sort of, you could say, and I think Cardijn recognised this too, this was sort of the magnanimous side of Cardinal Mercier. He could have put the foot down and stopped it there and then, but somehow he perceived enough in what the YCW and Cardijn were trying to do that he wanted to hand over the decision to the higher authorities. It was above his pay grade, as somebody said much later. And here's where we come to Cardijn's meeting with the Pope itself. And this is how Margaret Five and Jacques Miert write about it in their biography of Cardijn. You know, he's clutching his ticket and he goes past the Swiss guards, the bronze gate, up the staircase, the courtyard. He passes the officials, he slips through the rooms, another door, and finds himself trembling and stuttering at the feet of Pius XI. Very picturesque meeting. And the Pope asks him, "It's my son, what do you want?" And Cardijn, in his immortal words, "I want to save the young workers. I want to die for the working masses." And according to the story, boom, there's an immediate understanding between the Pope and the young priest. There in the Pope's study, the two of them together begin the first of what will become their annual talks together. And it finishes with Pius XI giving special blessings to those working with workers' organisations. And he explicitly endorses Cardijn's idea of not just working with the elite, but with the mass of the working class. So evidently Cardijn returns to Belgium joyful, and with that endorsement, they're able to continue on with the organisation of the national congresses and the publication of the manual and all the other things that allowed the movement to take off. But, look at that story. I've highlighted in red a couple of different phrases: biglietto or ticket, and the Pope's study. If you've got a ticket, somebody's given it to you. So it's been arranged. Something has been officially arranged for Cardijn to get there. What was that thing that had been arranged? Then he ends up in the Pope's study. He doesn't end up in a general audience or even a larger audience of a group of people on pilgrimage to Rome meeting with the Pope. He ends up in the Pope's personal study meeting the Pope, which means that the Pope didn't have any other appointments at that time, and Cardijn is there. So really the only conclusion you can reach is that however it happened, this personal audience was planned. He didn't just stumble through those progressively smaller doors until, boom, suddenly he was in front of Pius XI. What it implies is that there were people in the Vatican who knew who Cardijn was, and they made that meeting happen. They knew what he was on about, and they wanted him to meet the Pope. And if you look at it, you can understand it's very important to look at what was happening in the world at that time. Many of it we're all familiar, so much history there. We don't have to talk about it much today. But of course, this is less than 10 years after the Russian Revolution. And you can imagine the fears that there were of the spread of that around the world at that time. That was one side. The other side, of course, Pius XI's in Italy. Mussolini has taken power. And even if there were many Catholics sympathetic to Mussolini, there were others who saw much more clearly, and they were afraid of the rising influence of those fascist powers. In France, there was another movement which was known as the Action Française. You could call it not technically a fascist movement, but a proto-fascist movement, which had gained the support of many Catholics, including in Belgium, Francophone Belgium as well. So actually, the Vatican was worried, or it may be more correct to say that people working in the Vatican were worried. Vatican officials were worried, maybe not all of them, but enough of them that they thought something needs to be done. Now, it's important to remember here what happened to the Sion back in 1910. Many people were shocked at the outcome that had led to the closing down of the Sion. This was really probably not even the intention of the Vatican. They just wanted to gain control of the Sion, but actually what happened was that it closed down. So once Pius X was gone, his successor, Benedict, the 14th or the 15th, they actually tried to encourage Marc Sanier to relaunch the Sion, but it was World War I and that wasn't going to happen. After the war, what happens is just within weeks of Pius XI becoming the Pope, Sanier was organising an International Democratic Congress on Peace, and Pius XI sends greetings to that Congress. That's pretty significant, 12 years after the condemnation, the new Pope sends greetings. You know how the diplomacy works. There's a message that goes beyond the words that were in that greeting. 1923, it was the 25th anniversary of the death of Leon Ollie Leprune. One of his major students, a very famous philosopher called Maurice Blondel, sometimes known as the philosopher of Vatican II, held a kind of session in Rome in memory of Ollie Leprune, for which also Pius XI had sent a message. So this is all sort of showing that people were trying to rehabilitate, if not the Sion itself, but the work that it had been doing. And then people can see, and as I've said, Cardijn proclaimed it publicly, in Belgium, there's a priest who's actually trying to remake a new movement that follows in the spirit and the methods of the Sion. And even better, it's started by a priest, not by a lay person who's out of hierarchical control, but it's started by a priest, which in effect brings that movement back within the church hierarchical framework. So here's a solution that the church finds to that problem that they had. And this is kind of the backstory, which to me explains what happened and how it came to be that Pius XI was ready to endorse the movement. And practically, we can also see exactly how that meeting came about as well. Because there were obviously the nuncio, the job of the nuncio is to, in each country, is to tell the Pope what's happening. So the guy there was a guy called Clemente Micara. He'd obviously sent reports to Rome of what was going on. And, you know, the people in Rome had done their due diligence. They knew what was happening. Secondly, Cardijn's mentor was a Jesuit sociologist and canonist called Arthur Vermeersch. And at this time, he was now in Rome, teaching at the Gregorian. So he had an incredible network in that time in Rome. It's even true to say that I think that Cardijn was a protege of Vermeersch. So it really brought, in effect, Vermeersch was promoting his own exactly protege there. And the third person that played an important role was a French priest called Gaston Vanneuville, who was one of those democratic priests from France, actually from Lille, right on the border of Belgium, who had been a promoter of Christian democracy before he was sent off to Rome in 1908. And he'd actually been, he was trying to act as the interlocutor between the Sion and the Vatican to prevent them from being condemned. Obviously, he failed. But now he comes back and has a second go with these other people. And they're the people that somehow cleared the path for Cardijn to meet with Pius XI. And this is kind of the background to how it all happened. But what was the effect of all that? Well, obviously it had an immediate effect on the movement, which, as I've said, allowed the movement to take off, not only in Belgium, but within a couple of years across Europe, and soon, within 15 years, around the world. But it's interesting to look at the time later how people in the church evaluated that. And one of the people who's written probably, I would say, the most incredible sort of powerful statement about it that I've actually found was Yves Congar. I've got his photo there as a young priest. I think it dates from about 1928, around the time when he met with the YCW. So he knew the movement soon after it was born. In fact, he was living in Belgium. The French Dominicans were living in Belgium at that time because, another story, they'd been kicked out of Belgium, kicked out of France in 1903. So they were there. They watched the movement taking off. And look what he says. The creation of the YCW is one of the most emblematic events of our time, in which we find a prophetic initiative from the periphery, whereby a curate from suburban Brussels arrives in Rome with a letter from his archbishop. And the outcome was the consecration of this new movement by the Pope, who was also animated by that prophetic spirit, leading to what would become, that is, the Young Christian Workers becoming the prototype of the reforming creations, which became known as specialized Catholic action. This is the evaluation of Congar in 1950 in his famous book in English called True and False Reform in the Church. Obviously a huge personal impact on Congar, but also you can see through that the powerful impact that it all had on the church itself. And he goes on about it as well. It's not only, he explains exactly why it was so important, Congar. And again, he refers back to that inquiry method, which we talked about earlier, that inductive method, the idea of the YCW of transforming the milieu because they understood the real state of the milieu in which they lived. They weren't cut off from it like priests living in their abbeys or even in their parish houses. And it's also a fact that Congar used to run retreats for some of those young YCW leaders of the early 1930s. They'd come and do their retreats at Le Solchoir, the Dominican place outside of Brussels. So he was very familiar with it all. And it was kind of, it had a sort of, you can almost say, almost a magical impact on them. And later, this was not just a short-term thing. Later, remember, looking back in 1975, he makes an even stronger comparison. He compares that meeting with Pius XI and Cardijn to the meetings of St. Dominic, founder of the Dominicans, and St. Francis, evidently founder of the Franciscans, who were welcomed by Pope Innocent III in the 13th century. That's the level of importance that Congar, one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, that's the level of importance he placed on that meeting of Cardijn and Pius XI. So I really don't think you can top that, and I won't try. But I will just kind of finish with similar thoughts expressed by one of Congar's closest mates, Marie-Dominique Chenu, who was a little bit older than him, but also living in Belgium at that time. You can see how young he was in that photo there. And again, this is an article written by Chenu back in the 1930s, in which you can see how important they regarded this idea of this new idea of an apostolate of the milieu, concrete life, learning about Christianity transforming concrete life, just as we said in the YCW prayer, in a workshop, the office, in the factory, the neighbourhood. This was a revolutionary method of the YCW. It's not me saying that. That is Chenu. That is how people of that generation perceived the importance of that method and message of the YCW. So, you know, the phrase, also Cardijn, it's a biblical gospel phrase of being the leaven in the dough, the divine life, assuming the whole of human life, as Chenu put it, a continued incarnation in the mystical body of Christ. Work, businesses, trades, factories, offices, nothing is foreign to Christian life. The understanding of Marie-Dominique Chenu. And, you know, had a huge impact on a whole generation of Dominicans, many of whom became worker priests, many of whom supported the development of the YCW, not just in France and Belgium, but around the world. And we can see the importance of all that because it just, this decision of the Pope, this relationship developed between Cardijn and Pius XI, it enabled the spread of specialised Catholic action. And within the next 5 years, sometimes people talk about the vowels because it's all the vowels in French. The Jacques for the young workers, the Jacques for the students, the Jacques for the young farmers, the Juc for the university students, and the Gic, which came a little bit later for young people from in a business environment, or as they actually explicitly said, from a bourgeois milieu. So you had a mover for everybody by the end of the 1920s. And soon after, you had adult counterpart movements developing out of it, not to mention all those other movements which picked up the method and did other things with it. So by 1939, World War II is just starting. All this has already reached 50 countries. And by the time of Vatican II, somewhere between 90 and 100 countries around the world had those movements. It's an incredible success story, which also explains why many of those ideas came to be present in the understanding of the Second Vatican Council. But that's another talk as well. So I'll just finish with Cardinal Tisserand, who was a French cardinal. Actually, his brother had been a member of the Sion back at the start of the century, but he worked personally with Pius XI, and he gave this testimony later of how Pius XI had stated specifically that he had gained a new understanding of Catholicism of Catholic action from Cardijn. And even he began to base his talks about the role of the laity on what he'd learned from Cardijn. So this is the importance of Cardijn's message, not just for the YCW, but also for the teaching of Pope Pius XI. And I'm here in Kuala Lumpur, and I hear the Muslim prayer starting in the background, which is probably a sign that I should stop talking, and I will. And I think many of you are familiar with the model of the YCW, and I don't have to say much about it, but Cardijn's emphasis on the role of lay people having a specifically lay apostolate in the world, endorsed in the Vatican II documents, the idea of specialised movements, lay-led movements, organised autonomously from local to international level, the role of chaplain priests, not as directors, but as counsellors, mentors, and animators, all revolutionary ideas in the time. And I will even go so far as to say, to some extent, forgotten ideas, which is why it's important to remember them. So I'll just leave it all there, and with a few questions that I put together. Well, what does all that mean today? Is that all just the past? Is that just what the YCW did in the 1920s and in the time of the working class? Well, I think there's significant questions to ask. It's still a fact in Australia today that 50% of young people leaving school don't go on to university. What's the church's organised outreach for those young workers today? Tell me the answer if you know something. Besides the YCW, which gets very little support, I don't know of anything. I'm not saying they don't reach out sometimes to young workers, but that's kind of more incidentally, as the Belgian Catholic Youth Association had done back 50 years, nearly 100 years ago now. What resources, the church makes a lot of resources available to university ministries and campus ministries. What resources does the church make available for, whether it's the YCW or another movement, but what resources does the church in Australia make available for whoever it might be that might be working with those young workers? If you know of something, please tell me. So what response is the church providing to the situations of today? Anyway, we know that both the Australian Plenary Council and the Synod on Synodality prioritise formation. So is that a hook on which we can hang ourselves that could lead possibly to renewed support from the church for the Cardijn movements? Anyway, one way or the other, I think there's a model there. It's worth studying. We don't have to repeat what Cardijn did, but there's a model there, recognise the model of periphery and centre. We know how important even that phraseology is for Pope Francis. Maybe it's time now today for a renewal and a revival of the Cardijn model of a periphery centre partnership in the church. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I'm going to turn off my screen now, if I can figure out how to do it. Yeah, well, there you go. I actually don't have a chair for this session, so if anybody would like to make any comments, ask any questions, feel free to do so. We can have a bit of discussion, and when we're tired, we can stop.
Can I start off then?
Yeah, go for it, Bruce. Go for it.
Yeah, that was a very good presentation. Thank you very much for doing it and synthesizing it so well. I think you've brought out the central thing about the consciousness and responsibility, which is basically a method of empowerment for action, isn't it?
Correct.
So now they are precisely the elements that Pope Francis brings to synodality, and I don't think this is well understood. I mean, Francis is always talking, he structures his arguments and books on See Judge Act. He's very familiar with it, but I don't think we're hearing it that way. And I take your point very strongly that there seems to be a move back to devotional type of youth engagement, but with very notable exceptions of groups that are involved with refugees or asylum seekers and really practical sorts of things. But I think we need a bit of leadership and some at a certain level. I don't know how to do it, where it will come from, but I'm just conscious that the method of from below, that YCW of experience and reflection on life circumstances, there are a lot of different groups using a methodology like this in schools and so on, but in a more limited way. And I'd like to see some conversation between groups that are really thinking hard about this and how we move forward at this moment in what we can learn from Cardijn. As you say, he's not in our time. We need to do it differently. So, but how?
Yes, the how. Well, maybe there's somebody else here got some ideas to share, some experiences that might help show the way. Feel free to jump in. Has everything been said, has it?
No. I'll just say I'm just completed a commission to write a history
Sorry,
of the diocese.
could you introduce yourself, because I can't see.
Oh, hello, Marie Ganley, Dr. Marie Ganley. So I've just completed a long years of a commission to write the history of a diocese, Australian diocese. And I sent a section to diocesan staff responsible for youth ministry, pastoral ministry, and I sent a section leaving out chapters and abbreviations before. And I received a message to say, we think you should leave that we don't know what YCW stands for. We think you should leave it out. And I'm talking about diocesan pastoral ministry staff. That was a big shock. But I had given a lot of time to a whole chapter before, which I hadn't supplied for editing and reviewing. And I did explain very carefully in this history. So as a historian, what's lost is the history. What you've given us, that connection. We can talk about Francis and synodality, but we have nothing else to connect back to popes who are already dealing in a synodal way to engage youth, particularly working youth. So the history is lost, number one. So where do we go? Okay, the history of in our religious education programs of our secondary schools does not include historical background of the richness of what you've just presented now. So that to me is a massive gap. We're sort of talking about university campuses, but we're missing the formation that can occur where at least the spark is lit before they go beyond the gate. So I'm preaching because
No.
I've been looking at this for long years, and as an educator in both primary, secondary, and director of advancement on a university campus, I've watched them arrive on a university campus. So, yeah, formation and history is so far, I think, a basic groundwork to even getting to what the notion of a synod is all about. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. Thanks very much, Marie. That's great. Yeah, actually, very interesting, your comments on that diocesan history. Actually, it reminds me of about 10 years ago. There was a book to be published on Australian Catholic Youth Ministry, which actually was published. And they wrote to me kindly, asking me to write a chapter on the YCW, because they saw it, they did actually see it as part of the history, which was, at that level, was good, but I was also a little bit sort of peeved, because for them, the editors of the book, they viewed it, what at the YCW and the YCS as history, not the present, and even less the future. So I did actually take up the invitation. I did actually write a chapter in which I did do my best to sort of explain the importance of it for the future. Anyway, it's in the book, and the book's published. You can get it from Garrett, but I don't know how many people actually take any notice of my chapter at this point. Anyway, Greg Lopez, I see, has got a question. Greg,
thanks,
comment?
Stefan. Yeah, thank you. I find it interesting, some of the similarities of the context of the 1925 and what I see today. So there is a group of Catholics who are progressive, Sion, whose understanding of democracy rather than a progressive or a progress, or a Jesus who is for all kind of democracy, but then facing opposition by Catholics who see Catholicism in a more restrictive way. And I'm seeing how Christians supported a restrictive view of government in Australia in 2019. certainly in the US, Christians supporting a limited understanding of Christianity in the US now, and how does the Catholic Church, what kind of formation does the Catholic Church provide parishioners, Catholics, in the ability to see through these issues themselves and take action. So Pope Pius made a decision. Then how do we make this known to our leaders today, our Catholic leaders today? Thank you.
Yeah, big questions. I don't know the answer, but two things, if I can make a couple of points. One is I think we need models. I think we need the Cardijn's model. Actually, he modelled what the YCW could be in his first parish in Notre Dame in Larkin. That was the first thing. But the second thing, which I personally, I meant to mention it, but I had enough things to say. When you think about Fernand Tonnet and the rise of fascism in the 1920s, Mussolini and all that, I mean, aren't there any echoes of that today? There are big echoes, I think. And could that be a factor? Are there enough people in the church that are concerned enough about this that they might start to look again and think, well, geez, we need to be doing some formation that helps people to find their way and not just get sucked in by this kind of these political trends that are, I don't know if they're yet sweeping the world, but are developing. Yeah, anyway, that's another point. Who else would like? I see Charles Rue has got a comment there. Do you want to speak about that, Charles?
I'm not sure which comment it was.
But you can speak. But either or both. Yeah.
I believe that the YCW is a movement that works from below, and it follows the scientific method of induction. Whereas I think many of the clergy in the old days, and even probably more so currently, would love to still have control from the top, where they would dictate things to believe, things to do. And that's a style of Catholic action which split the church and split our Columban seminary in the 50s and the 60s. And it split the Justice and Peace organization of the Catholic Bishops' Conference in the 80s with Teresa and all those people, so that there's two different models of Catholic action vying with each other. And I think if we don't recognize the controlling one of Catholic action, we will run into trouble very quickly. So I'd be very careful of that top-down style. And it's often devotional, dictatorial. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Charles. Yep, personally, 100% agree. Okay. Oh, there's Ray Tamerman. Ray, would you like to say something?
Well, I've mainly written it there, but my wife and I spend about 2 to 3 months a year here in Australia. We're from Canada, and we spend our time out on the Sapphire Coast in New South Wales. Here, there's a group called Social Justice Advocates of the Sapphire Coast. They were started within the Catholic Church, have now gone well beyond, and they look at people who are homeless, housing, refugees, solar and wind energy, Timor-Leste, you name it, including a very vibrant youth group. To me, they are very much living out, without even necessarily being aware, the YCW approach to life. I've often thought that I wish our Catholic clergy here in the area were more connected with it, not to control it, but to walk alongside and to learn from each other. I think it would be totally rich.
Great. Yeah. Well, that's one of the, maybe that's one of the examples or models that we're looking for, the new models. So yeah, I said you put the link there too. So that's something for people, including myself, to follow up afterwards. Thanks very much, Ray. Yeah.
Can I just add to what Ray said there,
Yeah.
as part of this research, that when I interviewed parish priests who of, considerable age, they admitted that not only did they not know about YCW in their seminary training, but they didn't know about any other societies either. So to move into parishes, and these were people that priests that I interviewed who were prepared to be active in any way, but that was their admission. So it is not there now, and it is even less so because of the range of seminarians that we have in our seminaries at the moment. So it's not on the agenda in seminary training for any clerics to be involved in social action, let alone any other societies, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is the truth. Another aspect that we have to find a way to tackle. Yeah, well, look, we've been going just before the hour. Until is there anybody else that would like to make a comment, or I don't have to ask a question, but anybody else like to share any experience or give us some hope for the future?
It was just one of there was a doctoral thesis done by a young student a few years ago about, I think it was YCW or Catholic Action, and he quoted Pius XI saying, and I thought it was part of that interview, at last someone's talking to me about the masses. At last someone is talking to me.
That's right.
About the masses.
Yeah.
And it was something that gave you a glimpse that, a Pope, the 11th, the syllabus, is that he, the syllabus of errors? That's all you knew about him, but they were in touch. And that was a great comment that I really enjoyed and cherished.
Yeah. Yeah, that's there's no doubt for Cardijn that was a key point by Pius XI, that the idea of the masses. Yep. Jim, are you about to say something? I saw
you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how to get started. Look, I think young workers are people in the real milieu of their life. When they get a chance to do the review of life, they become prophets of what's actually going on. They can name and talk about what's going on, and they're often way ahead of, remember the casual work campaign in the Australian YCW in the 1990s, well before any unions got involved. Unions thought casual workers were not workers. More recently, had a little group going in Port Augusta, just some casual people or just some people. Some were Catholics. They brought friends along from other religions, some no religions.
Yeah. Unfortunately, your voice is breaking up a bit,
tomato farm, and you noticed
I don't know if it's the connection or your microphone.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I think the spiritual is important along with the action.
Your voice has disappeared.
Okay.
Charlie here.
Yep.
I'd like to make an emphasis on the idea of method of the Cardijn movement. Here in Canberra, where I live at the moment, I have very little contact with young people. If I do contact young people, they seem to be many of them seem to be in some form of trauma, and they want to be happy and feel good and all those sort of things, but don't seem to know how to go about attaining anything. But the group I'm contact most are actually people to do with the environmental Laudate Si movement. Now, they seem to be totally afraid of making any recognition of environmental problems where they live. Yeah, whether it's transport in Canberra, whatever it be, noise, pollution. I think they're dead afraid to actually look at an issue. And so what they want, they don't seem as though they want to take responsibility for identifying an issue and saying, what can I do about it? What can we do about it? Their fear then leads them to look for bishops and priests to give them directions, and they want to get told what to do. So I think that I think this is one of the realities of the environmental movement here in Canberra, which to me, if it's going to have any effect, it's got to use the Cardijn method, and the Pope used that in Laudate Si. So where do I sort of think from there? I really don't know. But I think we've got to recognize that there is a problem that people just do not have a method, and they don't even know how to look for a method. So that's what I want to say.
All right. Looking for a method. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. I see that Jim has put his message into the chat here. Actually, he's put it to me in a private message instead of to everybody, but I think he meant it to go to everybody. And he says, I think the spiritual or devotional is a helpful accompaniment to the review of life. I invited some young workers to meet at Port Augusta. There were some Catholics who invited friends, including another Christian, a Buddhist, and a Hindu. All joined enthusiastically in the opening prayer. Some came to Mass. They started an action to teach English to the seasonal workers in the town. The group wound down as the young workers moved on from Port Augusta. We had a reunion at which Z realised, I'm not sure anyway, realised a major achievement was the friendship. The issue of loneliness among young workers was massive. So that's Jim sharing the experience of the group there. Maybe you've shared it to everybody. Oh, yes, you've shared it to everybody now. Yeah. Well, thanks very much for that, Jim. Yeah, I see that we can all see that now. So, it's great. There is signs of hope out there. I don't know how we conclude this. I think we've been going for an hour. Is there anybody else that would like to say something that hasn't had a chance? Or...
Yes,
yep.
yes. Maureen Kelly.
Maureen, yep.
A lot of schools I know are doing things to help the refugees because their schools are into, looking after the refugees. So that's one thing. Another thing is with the state of the world, the hate and all the war and everything else, I've started and told other people about singing peace songs together with groups and that to just help to spread the peace around where we are, and hopefully it'll go further. So they say that singing is praying twice. Not sure whether Charles agrees with that, but so I think that's okay. Good on you, Charles. Thanks. I just think that if we get Dutton as the new Prime Minister, I think I'll just go on strike, and I don't know, because there's so much hatred in the world. So I think we need to pray for love and peace.
Great. Thank you very much, Maureen. Well, that sounds like kind of might be a good closing reflection.
There's one thing I'd like to say.
All right.
The group I was most impressed with here in Canberra are the community independent politicians. Now, they work from grassroots issues, and they work from the local community felt needs. And they had very good Zoom programs, just 10-minute segments, and they showed how you can organise at the local level. So it's community independent project. and they have a very, very good Zoom resource about, and to me, their methodology is extremely Cardijn, extremely according to reflection action. I've been more impressed with those community independent project people than I have been with any church person in recent times.
Yeah, good point.
Very good, yeah.
All right then, last call. Thanks to everybody for your comments, and thanks for joining today. So I think we'll call it an evening. Yeah, well, anyway, I just wanted to kind of pay homage to Cardijn and to Pius XI for establishing that model, and in this year of hope, Jubilee year for the YCW and the Church. And let's also think of Pope Francis while I mention it. So let's hope that we can offer support to those young workers that are meeting in Port Augusta and elsewhere, and to those people taking action, the South Coast, was it, Bega and places like that. So yeah, there are signs of hope. We need to encourage ourselves. We need to remember our history. Thank you very much.